Children. All Our Children's mission is to build the movement for education equity by supporting congregations and their members who are exploring, forming, and leading community partnerships with public schools. And we do this because too many children, most of them living in poverty, and many of them children of color, receive a substandard education. And as Christians, we do not believe that this is God's dream. We believe that Jesus calls the church to participate and to join our communities, to serve children, and to challenge injustice. To learn more about All Our Children and our growing library of resources, and to sign up for our newsletter, which is the best way to stay in touch with what's coming up, you can find us at allourchildren.org. Today, with our guests Carol Burris and Maggie Garret, we'll be talking about school privatization. What does the word privatization mean? What it looks like when it shows up in school districts? And what the evidence tells us about the fact that privatization not only does not improve student learning, but it actually harms student outcomes and damages the social fabric of our communities. We're going to be sharing some resources that you can use to find out more about privatization efforts in your area, and how, as faith leaders, you can join with other advocates for education equity to resist these efforts in your local context. This session is being recorded, and we're broadcasting on Facebook Live, and it will be available for you to view and share through Facebook immediately after our conversation. And for those who are joining us on the call, we will also be sending a direct link to this recording around, along with any resources that are mentioned during the call. So we welcome our questions and thoughts from those of you who are joining us online during this discussion. And Mary Liz Murray, who is All Our Children's Director of Programming and Communications, is going to talk to you now about how to use those tools. Mary Liz?
Thanks, Lally. For anybody who is not familiar with Zoom, as you're looking at it on your screen, you should be able to scroll over the video that you see, and a black menu bar will pop up at the bottom of your screen if you're viewing on a laptop or a desktop computer. And you'll see a chat bubble that says chat, and you will also see a Q&A option. The chat bubble is a great place to click to be in conversation with all the people participating on the call, to ask questions. And I will be monitoring that chat and answering your questions and leaving resources and links to resources in that chat box. If you have a question that you want to ask a little more privately or a sideline question, you can send that directly to me using the Q&A function.
Great. Thanks, Mary Liz. Carol Burris is Executive Director of the Network for Public Education, and Maggie Garret is Legislative Director of Americans for Separation of Church and State, and she co-chairs the National Coalition for Public Schools. Maggie and Carol, we're delighted. Welcome to you both. We're so happy to have you here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, in order for you to introduce yourselves a little bit to our participants, I want to invite you, and Carol, I'll start with you first. Just tell us your name and where you live. Tell us a little bit about the purpose of your organization and what you actually do there.
Right. My name is Carol Burris. I'm a retired high school principal. I was a public school educator for 25 years. And after I retired, I decided to do this work because I was so frightened by what I was seeing, which was, I believe, the destruction of public education through privatization. And I joined the Network for Public Education as Executive Director. I didn't plan to do it, but Diane Ravitch, who is our president and well-known education historian. You just don't say no to Diane. She is relentless. And I've been doing that work now for about 3 years, and I love it. The Network for Public Education was founded by Diane and Anthony Cody, who's a retired teacher, back in 2013. And it really was in response to what we're talking about today. So our mission is to preserve and support and improve public education in this country at a time when we believe that that it's under attack. And so we do a variety of things. We issue reports, we issue white papers, we do action alerts. We work, for example, very closely with the organization that Maggie co-chairs, as well as with the NAACP. To make sure that when something is happening legislatively, either in the states or at the federal level, our members are able to react. We also have a that's the 501c3. We also have a 501c4, which does more of the lobbying, as well as does endorsements when it's appropriate.
Great, thank you so much, Maggie. Oh, and Carol, where are you talking to? Where are you today when you're as you talk to us?
I'm in Queens, New York.
There you go. There you go. Maggie, tell us a little bit about your organization, where you are, and what your role is there.
Sure. So I work for Americans United for Separation of Church and State. We are in Washington, D.C. We have a legal department, so we sue people. We have the legislative department, which is my team, and we work in both the fight in Congress, and we work in the states as well on either supporting or opposing bills that affect church-state separation. We have a field department that works with people around the country, action alerts, helping them get involved, meetings, those sorts of things. So we have sort of a public education, grassroots, legal and legislative team all working together. And I came to this issue of school vouchers really through the lens of church-state separation, through Americans United. So I went to law school, knew I wanted to do public interest, good stuff that made me feel good when I went to bed at night. And I think that for me, church-state separation is the only way to have true religious freedom. And so, I came to Americans United thinking that the most important thing, free speech, all these things are really important, but being allowed to believe what you want to believe, there's something just intrinsic to who you are. And I tell everyone my Republican father and my Lutheran pastor are the people who taught me about church-state separation. So, being at AU, you learn very quickly that one of the big issues is vouchers. And 90% of the money and the kids in most voucher programs go to religious schools because they are cheaper. And so this really is funneling money, taxpayer money from public schools to religious schools. So that's how we get there. But then as I've been working more and more, I realize there are so many problems with vouchers, which gets me more and more fired up, whether it's, undermining public schools, undermining civil rights, harming the students that are in there. And so working at AU, I sort of went up the chain of NCPE, the National Coalition for Public Education, and became the co-chair of that organization. And we are a coalition of more than 50 organizations that work to fight vouchers on the national level. So it is religious organizations like the Union for Reform Judaism and the Baptist Joint Committee, to the NAACP, to Lambda Legal, who works on LGBT issues, education groups, civil rights groups, disability groups, on and on and on down the list that work on different areas, but all agree that private school vouchers are bad education policy.
Great, thank you so much. Just as a point of interest, I think we at All Our Children hosted a conversation a couple of months ago on this very question of the separation of church and state. And what does it mean when we talk about a local congregation establishing a relationship with a local school? Because many of us who are in this work and in this and do this work as a response to a sense of missionary call, if you will, we get that pushback a lot. And within All Our Children, we are very, very crystal clear about the kinds of conversations that we have in schools with children, with teachers, with parents on the school grounds. We are also clear when we're back home in our congregation that we claim our faith motivation as the reason that we are building these relationships in our local communities. But we respect that boundary for exactly the reasons, Maggie, that you're talking about. It is an issue of protecting everybody's religious freedom. That there is no religious content in the public schools. So that's just an interesting point. So thank you both. So I want to start by clarifying some terms here. So let's talk about, what does privatization actually mean? And we hear charters banded about. We hear vouchers. Some states and cities like Boston have public charters. It gets a little bit confusing. So, Carol, can you talk a little bit about charters in this privatization space? What do we mean by a charter, and how is that a dimension of privatization?
Right. Well, what privatization really means is taking the principles of the private sector, the corporate sector, and applying them to education, with the biggest part of that being the idea that competition, when combined with choice, is going to be the panacea to improve education in the United States. So charter schools are probably the biggest sector in terms of privatization. It's very interesting when people talk about public charters. That term actually came from ALEC.
And ALEC is what?
I'm trying to remember right now. The Legislative something council, but essentially it's what it does is it creates very conservative, usually what people would consider right-wing legislation for the states, and it's funded by the Koch brothers primarily. And that's where the term came from. And it's sort of a very unusual term, because the truth of the matter is the only thing that's really public is that they get public funding. Charter schools are by their very nature run by private boards. And you have different kinds. Some are complete nonprofits. Others are for-profit charter schools, and then still others the school itself may be nonprofit, but it's being run by a for-profit board. An example would be the BASIS charter schools that are very popular in Arizona and some other states, where over 50% of the funding, public funding, is going to a for-profit board to run the BASIS schools. And then there are the online charter schools, and nearly all of those are for-profit. They may have a not-for-profit front, but again, like K-12, for example, or Pearson are running the schools. So that's, one level of school privatization. I think Maggie now is going to talk about the second level, which is vouchers.
Yeah, before we turn to you, Maggie, I just want a point of clarification, Carol. You said that that privatization is largely about applying the principles of, and it sounded like you meant management principles and sort of governance principles of the private sector. But isn't it also, and you did suggest this, I just want to highlight this, isn't it also an issue of the public school district subcontracting actual cash to a management company whose purpose is to make a profit by running schools?
Well,
so
it can be. In the case, for example, of the charter schools that are run by the charter management organizations and the education management organizations. Yeah, you really find, you will find within a public school, what people will call a traditional public school, they'll have vendors that they work with, but having a for-profit agency coming in and running the school, that doesn't happen. It's local control. The people who govern are school boards or their mayors. There are always people that are elected by the public. That's not the case, for example, with charter schools, where they appoint members, so that you will have a lot of charter schools. The boards are composed primarily of billionaires, many of whom live out of state and have really no connection with that neighborhood school.
And you have to wonder what the billionaires' interest is in running the schools that their kids don't go to. I just wonder, right? So, Maggie, can you talk a little bit about privatization, through the lens of vouchers, more specifically in that terminology, because that's where we're really going to focus our conversation this afternoon.
Sure. So vouchers, essentially vouchers are when you take, the taxpayer gives their money to the government, and then the government gives it to a student to go to a private school. So that's traditionally what people think of as vouchers. So it's taking money out of the public treasury, taking it away from what could be used for public schools and using it for private schools. And then there's other sorts of terms that people have been using recently, and it's different ways of having a voucher. In my opinion, they're all vouchers. They just have different mechanisms, and they're kind of shell games to make it look like they're not just pure vouchers. So one, they're education savings accounts. I think they are the most frequent. We see now in bills in the states, they're called education savings accounts. They sound lovely. They're essentially vouchers that you can use for either tuition or other things as well. So what happens is the school, or the taxpayer, I pay taxes to the government then takes money out of the public treasury and puts it in a bank account for parents, and parents can use that money for a private school or other things. So again, say it's a voucher with a nicer sounding name that can be used for more things, but still taking money out of the public schools. And then there's a more complicated mechanism called a tuition tax credit. And this is where I think the real shell game comes in, because people claim that it's not really money in the public treasury and therefore it's not a voucher at all, but it is a voucher. So what happens here is they set up organizations called scholarship granting organizations. So it's like a nonprofit called a scholarship organization. And what happens here is, instead of me as the taxpayer giving money to the government who then gives it to the student, I could be a corporation. I give money to a scholarship granting organization. That organization gives money then to a student to go to a private school. And then I go to the government and say, I gave $5,000 to the scholarship granting organization, and they give me a $5,000 credit on my taxes. So it's dollar for dollar. So I give it to the scholarship granting organization, and then the government pays me. So it is still money that otherwise would be going to public schools, because instead of them giving to the scholarship organization, I give it to the scholarship organization and they give it back to me. And these are almost more problematic because the accountability is even less, because it's a scholarship granting organization, not a government organization. So they're not subject to public records requests. There's less accountability of where the money is going. There's fewer rules on them. How do you find out what the test scores are? So tuition tax credits, I think, are perhaps the most dangerous of all of them. And yet people find them the least troubling, because until they know more about them.
So what are some states that have active tuition tax credit programs?
There's a tuition tax credit program in Georgia. I should have pulled up the numbers. There are a lot around the states. I mean, Florida on its own right now has 3 of them. Arizona, I think, has, is it 3 tuition tax credits and 1 ASA, or backwards? So like different states have different programs, and there are a lot of them.
And if I could just jump in a little bit on the tax tuition credit programs, Pennsylvania is another state with it. Sometimes what happens with them is that people can actually make money. So you're not necessarily you're not giving this to your own child. You're using this tax credit as a tax credit to pay less taxes. These are very attractive to businesses. Pennsylvania, for example, has theirs exclusively with businesses. In the state of Virginia, you get that 100% back. So everything you give, you get back, right? Now, wouldn't the Episcopal Church love this, right? So they could say to their parishioners, everything you give back, or any other organizations like MPE. So, I mean, it's really a farce. But then what happens is they're able to claim it on their federal taxes. So there are people who actually give advice as to how you can make money by donating.
So you get a tax deduction from your state taxes.
You get a credit.
And you get a credit. So that's an actual cash for cash. That's what a credit is. Correct. And then you can also claim that as a nonprofit contribution against your federals, and then you get a further deduction from that. So it's not dollar for dollar.
Yeah, especially if you're one of the people who fall the minimum tax. That's where folks who are subject to the minimum tax credit, they can actually walk away and make money. And with the education savings accounts too, I mean, one of the big problems with them is the amount of money that you're talking about. Vouchers tend to be limited amount of money. Education savings account in many states, including Arizona, it's 90% of what the public school district would have spent. The other 10% goes for administration. And in the state of Arizona, and some of them, they actually put it on a debit card. So the parent gets a debit card, And there's very little supervision. And there have been a lot of cases of abuse where parents have not spent the money on their children, but have rather used it to do things like buy big screen TVs or to buy educational items and then return them and then use the card in the local store. Because with ESAs, and unfortunately they become very, very popular, you don't even have to use them in a private school. You can use them for homeschooling.
Mm.
For online schooling. You can use them for horseback riding lessons.
I just pulled up, this session, voucher programs have passed, but I just pulled up at the start of this legislative session, state legislative sessions, there were 51 school choice programs around the country in 24 states. There are 25 pure voucher programs, 21 tuition tax credits, and 5 education savings accounts programs.
And how many states, Maggie?
There are 51 private school choice programs in 24 states. And that was before this session, and more have passed in the last 3 months. Okay,
so half of our states are have these laws on the books. All right, so let's talk now about, now that we understand what we're talking about, let's talk about why this matters and what the harm is to our communities and to our schools. So what gets lost when there is when we lose local public accountability and supervision of our local school districts? Maggie, do you want to start with that?
Sure. First of all, it undermines public schools. I think we've all sort of been talking about how this is draining money away from our public schools. And, I think our public schools are really, really important. They are the sense of community in the town. They are the melting pot. It is where all students are accepted. So regardless of your religion or race or, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, you can go to the public schools and they will serve you. And what vouchers really do is they sort of segregate us out, right? Like, kids who are interested in this issue or their parents are of this particular religion go to this school, and other kids with this particular interest go to that school. So I think it's segregating kids not just by race or disability, but by interest, by amount of money they have. Vouchers are not going to pay for the best schools around the country because they're very small amounts. So parents who have extra money can use the voucher to then go to a better school. Kids who don't have any extra money are going to go to the schools that aren't so great. I think that they're also really not just undermining public education as a whole, but vouchers really are not improving academic achievement for students. So they are this false promise that, you hear the word private school and it sounds very fancy. I think, unfortunately, that's what a lot of parents think, like, oh, it's a private school, it's got to be great. But if you look at studies across the country, private schools are actually, using vouchers, are not improving academic achievement. So we have studies that show that in Louisiana, Indiana, Ohio, and DC, kids are actually performing worse on testing than they are in their public schools. And then the other testing shows that there's no improvement at all, right? So we're spending all of this money to undermine our public schools to put kids in programs that are not improving or actually a detriment to their education. And so that's actually hurting these kids who, their parents think that they are sending them to great schools. That's why they are doing it. And unfortunately, we hear a lot about, parental choice, they can make the best decisions for their kids. And I do think that they know their kids the best, but these schools are not required to give parents the information that they need to make the best decisions. In the DC voucher program, which is the only federally funded voucher in the country, there have been reports showing that the information parents get, it's incomplete, it's incorrect. And so that is what parents are basing their opinions on. And then, of course, I'll stop because I know there's lots of things I don't want to go through the whole list. So Carol has some things to talk about, although it's hard to believe that we could end because we could probably talk about this for hours and hours. But, there's lots of problems with civil rights protections, lack of them, and what it does really to kids for disabilities, where it systematically excludes them from the entire program.
Great. Yeah, so Carol, what would you like to add?
Yeah, just a little bit, because Maggie covered it so well. To the question of what's lost, students' rights are lost. They are. The schools don't have to accept everybody. They can be very selective. And you can be thrown out of them for reasons that, as a public high school principal, I could never have done, nor would I have wanted to do. The other thing that is lost is student achievement. And it's not only lost in the way that Maggie talked about, which the preponderance of studies are showing us now that kids lose when they move to a voucher school. But a lot of these programs don't even measure achievement. The Network for Public Education right now is working with SHOT on a national report card. And we were appalled by the number of programs that don't require any testing at all.
That's the SHOT Foundation based in Boston?
That is the SHOT, yeah.
The SHOT Foundation.
And, that education savings account program in Arizona, for example, the parents do not need to provide any evidence that their child has learned. None. Zero zip. The only evidence that they have to provide to get the money the following year is that they spent the money the year before. I mean, I couldn't believe it when I read the statute. And it's not just Arizona. You see the same things in Florida and so many of the states where public money is going into one of these various voucher schemes, and they do not have to provide any evidence that the child learned. The majority of them, even if their state has a testing requirement, is not the state tests. They can use other tests. And so it's ironic to us who are in the public education sector, where we see schools that are really struggling with very difficult challenges, to be closed over test scores, where now we have a whole other sector that is unaccountable, and where the money's going. I mean, in the state of Indiana, a charter school can be shut down for poor performance, only to turn around and open up as a voucher school. And there's no way to stop it.
I watched something. I had some direct experience along these lines. I volunteered as part of my former congregation in Boston. We had a volunteer relationship with an elementary school in Dorchester that served a population of multiply needy children, many of them non-English speakers at home, many of them children of immigrants, many of them with one or more learning or social emotional disability. And there was one academic year when one grade level did not meet the state externally mandated rate of improvement in one subject. And the Commissioner of Education had an option, but the option that he executed was to take the management away from the public school leadership that had been there for a number of years and had cultivated a fabulous culture within the school, and give that to a private, to outsource it to a private contracting company from out of state. And they came in, and in 3 years, they didn't meet the targets either. So they were kicked out, and it was turned back over to the management of the public school leadership. And of course, by that point, the community within the school had been so stressed by these multiple turnovers and the difficulty of reestablishing a team of teachers and a culture in the building that flowed and smooth, that they were way, way, way further back than they would have been if the superintendent had just had a little bit of a sense of flexibility. So that was a very direct experience that we observed because we were in the building and we were in relationship with these teachers and children. Yeah. So what are the motivations of the, and we're going to try not to demonize people, but what are the motivations of the people who were pushing and driving these? What's the most generous language that the two of you, I know this is a challenge for you personally, I'm sure it would be for me, but what can you give us on that? Which of you would like to start?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, look, I think that a lot of people who are involved in this work are well-meaning people, and they believe that they don't believe in public education. I mean, and there's a spectrum, right? There are some people who just believe that competition will make things better, and a lot of times they really don't like public unions very much, and this is all a way to get around unions. And then there's another extreme, which I think is represented by by people like our current Secretary of Education, who really think that they're furthering God's work by doing this, because they believe that public education, and with its what they would consider to be liberal values and social justice agenda, is on the wrong path, and that there needs to be a return to a more prescriptive and a more religious education for kids. So I think the phrase even that was used by the DeVos family was advancing God's kingdom. And so it's, I think they all believe in their heart that they're doing the best thing for kids. I mean, obviously there were operators in this sector who were doing it for a profit, but that's more at the individual school level.
So Maggie, with your permission, I'm going to return back to some concrete examples that we can share with our participants and switch gears here in our conversation. We'd like to talk about some examples, or actually, Carol, this might be a question back to you. Some examples of a school or a district that you know of that has been harmed by these privatization initiatives or legislation. Can we get this conversation to a local district or school level?
Right.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, to go to the school level, I'll probably have to give an example of charters. And the same thing would happen if it was a school district that had a lot of vouchers on it. Where Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where they have lost millions and millions of dollars from kids leaving the district, because the part of the concept behind all of this, and this applies to both charters as well as to most voucher programs, is the idea of backpack funding. And that idea, it's a cutesy term, which essentially means the money goes with the child. So let's just think about this in very general terms, and this has certainly happened in Bethlehem. You have, let's say, 3 kids at a grade level who leave your school. And with those kids goes $15,000 worth of funding, right? It's usually more if it's a special education student. So now your district has lost $45,000, beginning teacher salary perhaps, or certainly teaching assistants. But where are your savings? You don't have any. You don't fire a teacher because you've lost 3 students. The lights still have to go on. The building has to be heated. The buses still have to run. The superintendent has to be paid. It's almost, I tell people, as if you're sending your child off to college and you have to pay room and board. Well, you pay that room and board, but you don't realize those savings in your home. You have maybe a small amount of savings, no matter how big an eater your child may be. And that's what's happening. And when you look at states, for example, like the state of Arizona, which is really, I think, one of the worst in terms of so many different privatization programs, what's happened over time is that the schools are not adequately funded. So what happens? You don't have the funds anymore. What do you cut? Music, band, art, counselors, right? And over time, the education that you're able to offer becomes worse and worse. Your class sizes expand. And we know that that has a real deleterious effect on student learning when class sizes get too high. And all of the time, what's happening is now all of that money, whether it's going in the backpack that goes to a charter school, the backpack that goes to an education savings account, the backpack that goes to a traditional voucher, all of that money is leaving. So you have, for example, right now in Garret and Muncie, schools that are going bankrupt because of all of the charters and vouchers in Indiana. They cannot operate anymore. And now what's happening is very needy student populations. Now what's happening is they're bringing in people to manage. Right? They think that Ball State University can do a better job, but as you brought up, Ollie, very often what winds up happening is things don't get any better, but different organizations get richer trying to do the work that should be done at the local level. Chicago is another place where so much funding has been lost.
Maggie, I want to turn our attention to some successful efforts to resist some of this work, and I know that your organization is very active at the federal level. Can you talk to us about some of the coalitions that you've been able to put together at the federal level, and what some of the issues are that you're facing there in Washington around this topic?
Yeah, this is incredibly timely because we are currently fighting an attempt to create a voucher for military-connected students. So oftentimes, as you all probably know, they will not say this is a voucher for everyone. They will sort of pick a vulnerable population, and then you sound sort of terrible saying, well, I don't want to help kids, military-connected kids, but actually the voucher is actually going to harm those military-connected kids. So they'll start small with a vulnerable group, and then it ends up like building up, and suddenly you have a voucher for everyone. But the current attempt is to use money called impact aid. I don't know if you're that familiar with it, but if you're a school district and you're near a military base, well, the military base doesn't have to pay local taxes. Public schools are funded by local taxes. And so the federal government has recognized this. And so that public schools in those areas can survive, they have something called impact aid, which is they give money to these public schools near the military bases or tribal lands so that they can survive as a public school. So this voucher proposal would take the money, the impact aid money that would go to the public school, and instead turn it into a voucher. And so this is something that the Heritage Foundation has been pushing, and a freshman legislator from Indiana, Representative Banks, introduced it. And when that came out, we connected not just with our normal NCPE groups, which is disability groups, education groups, et cetera, but we really reached out to the military family groups. And we've been incredibly successful at getting all of those groups to speak out on this issue. Groups that maybe not, hadn't really thought about vouchers in the past, but realize that this is taking away impact aid from their public schools and is going to cripple the schools that serve 90% of their kids. And so we were really able to do social media. We were able to just get in places you wouldn't normally get into, right? Like they maybe have connections with their military, but the Coast Guard Auxiliary has a different connection to people in the Senate and the House than we do. And so interestingly enough, to just, yesterday or a couple of days ago, the Trump administration came out and said they don't support the Banks bill because it would limit impact aid. Betsy DeVos is testifying before the House Education Committee today. She said she doesn't support the Banks bill as written, with the funding being impact aid. So I've never seen Betsy DeVos come out against a voucher program before. And so I feel like that's a pretty big win. I mean, although as I'm saying this, breaking news for all of you, that in the Senate committee that works on the bill where they're trying to add this voucher, there's 2 amendments that have just been introduced in that committee to add it into the Senate bill. So one of the things about vouchers is if you have a win literally at the beginning of this webinar, we actually have not fully won it by halfway through the webinar. So there are constant attacks. But I think, again, getting Betsy DeVos to say she doesn't support a voucher program is a pretty big win.
Yeah, congratulations on that. How about at the state level? Are there success stories that either of you can share with us about successful efforts to resist this? Carol is nodding. Do you want to take a start with that, Carol?
Yeah, Texas is a state where they've had big wins year after year, and I mean, you would think that certainly in a state that has the politics of Texas, vouchers would be there. And interestingly enough, a lot of the reason for that win is the faith community in Texas. Charles Johnson, who leads Pastors for Texas Children, has taken this up as a cause and has talked about the importance of religious freedom, and in a very, very strong way said, hey, listen, I don't want my tax dollars to be used to push somebody else's religion, and they don't want their tax dollars to be used to push mine. And he's worked with his booming Baptist preacher voice all over the state capitol, and every year they come up, and every year they have not gone anywhere. And that is really remarkable. What's happening in Arizona now is very interesting too. Their ESA program is similar to what Maggie described before, where it started very small and then kept expanding. And expanding by including other groups. And now, finally, in the last legislative session, they pretty much said eventually all kids were going to be eligible for ESAs. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And a group called Save Our Schools Arizona went and actually had it a petition to put it as a referendum for the public to vote on and weigh in on this issue. And they have been trying mightily, both the Koch brothers as well as the DeVos family, to make sure that that never comes to a vote. Because the truth is, every time this comes to a public referendum, it has been defeated. So every time. So we are holding our breath and hoping that in November, what will happen is they will roll back this expansion of the ESA program. What we're hearing is that the legislature is actually thinking about rolling it back and then reintroducing it to get around the law, which I think is very, very sad. Let the people have a voice. If this is what the people of Arizona want, then.
I want to pause and thank you for both of those examples, Carol. I want to pause and lift up your example of Charles in Texas, because what we see there is a faith-motivated leader talking to the faith communities, and he is making the connection, right, between what he believes and what his fellow pastors preach and believe, and their opportunity to be leading and influencing their communities, and what they're seeing happening in the public sphere. I think a lot of time as Christians, and I know this is true of us as Episcopalians often, I'm an Episcopalian, not everybody and all our children is, but I am, is that there's a shyness, there's a reluctance, there's a hesitancy to speak up as citizens, right? Our what we see and what we value in our civic spaces is informed by our faith and what we believe is right and good for humanity. And for us to be able to support each other and to practice speaking about what we want for everybody in secular terms that are appropriate for secular spaces, but to allow our motivations and our values to be seen and to be articulated. And that's what Charles has done. As you say, year after year, he keeps beating back these these initiatives. So as faith leaders, we can have more influence than I think we sometimes think we can. So, yeah. So what resources, I want to make sure we have time to talk about resources, and we've got a good 10 minutes now at least. So what resources are available, whether to parents or clergy or volunteers in their communities, in their congregations, who want to learn more about these issues in order to be effective resistors? So Maggie, let's turn to you first.
Sure. So for Americans United, and I know NPE because they have an amazing list, we both have action alerts, right? Or, sign up for our emails. We will send you emails when there's something to do in the states, in Congress. So that is a great resource if you sign up for our listservs. And then as the co-chair of the National Coalition for Public Education, we created a really comprehensive website. It's ncpecoalition.org. And we have kind of everything you can imagine on there. We have all this, if you want to read the studies are there. If you want to read summaries of the studies on vouchers across the country, those are there. We have talking points about every issue you can imagine, whether it's civil rights or students with disabilities. We have fact sheets on why religious communities oppose vouchers, written by us along with our friends at Baptist Joint Committee and the Union for Reform Judaism. So faith voices out there explaining why this is bad for the religious communities, religious schools and churches. So there's tons of information. There's latest news. There's explanations of day-to-day what's happening with legislation, types of vouchers. There's just a lot of information there.
Great. Carol, how about the Network for Public Education? What do you have to share with our participants?
Last year we developed some one-sheet fact sheets that people have found to be very, very helpful, called Privatization Explained. And there are 13 separate fact sheets, and each revolve around a question. right? Um, that addresses something to do with vouchers and ESAs and their impact, and also charter schools as well. So I highly recommend that people take a look at that. I sent the link just a little while ago to Mary Liz, and I'm sure she can share it with everyone. The second thing that I think will be very helpful, that will be coming out shortly, is what I referred to before, which is our privatization state report card, where we analyze the laws around privatization in every one of the states and the District of Columbia. And I think people are going to be pretty surprised, not only to see where their state is in terms of school privatization, but also to see some of the things that we talked about earlier, where we have a whole section on civil rights and how there are not civil rights protections, which states have them, which states don't, testing requirements, funding, and lots of other very important information that I think people will not be able to get anywhere else.
So the kinds of arguments that I hear people giving that have been tricky for me to engage with thoughtfully, just sort of off the top of my head, are things like parental choice. I mean, it's hard to argue against parents making decisions on behalf of their children. And yet, I know that in Boston, where housing segregation is still rampant and deeply, deeply entrenched, the many African American and Latino parents advocate very strongly for system-wide choice, because they want to make sure that they can get their child into the school that's a high quality school, and the high quality schools are often not in their neighborhoods, whereas whiter and more affluent parents are advocating within the Boston school system for community schools, so that children would be assigned. But even as I'm speaking, I'm realizing now, wait, these aren't really analogous, because I'm talking within the Boston public school system. So all of that, none of that's about privatization. But it's hard to argue that parents should not be able to send their children to a school that they want to send them to. So sorry for that little detour. But let's help us as listeners and as learners on this topic that you two know so much more about. Help equip us for how would I respond to a parent who says, it's important to me that I be able to use my tax dollars to educate my children in the school of my choice. Yeah, Carol, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is, who's doing the choosing? There's the illusion of choice, but especially in the case of vouchers, the schools are doing the choosing.
Exactly.
And that's a really big factor.
The schools are doing the choosing because they get to decide whether my kid can go there.
Absolutely.
And is that what you mean? And if my child has some attention issues or some authority resistant issues, that child might be coached out of the school, for example.
Or never allowed in, because programs, you can look at discipline records. There are laws that say if the child's been suspended, the school doesn't have to take them. Not true of a public school, but true of many private schools. You could have test scores admissions in private schools. Right. So, the first question is, who's really doing the choosing? Most of the time it is in the parents. And the second thing I would say is that for most parents, their first choice is a good neighborhood public school. That's what they want.
That's what they
want.
And
when we take all of this energy and we put it into all of these other places and we take the funding out of it, we're doing work avoidance. We should be doing the work that you talked about in the beginning, which is making sure that every child has an excellent public school in their neighborhood that is well-resourced, that has the counselors, the social workers, and all the other services that they need. And to understand that what one school needs based on its student population can be very different than what another school needs, and be willing to give the resources to that school. Otherwise, really, what are we doing, right? We're trying to pull all these escape valves, and it just doesn't work. And as you said earlier, what's left behind then is a population of students with the greatest needs, the kids that nobody wants. And as a Christian, I find that to be an appalling and unacceptable state.
Thank you for that testimony. Maggie, I'm wondering if you can recommend or point our listeners to local organization, not local, but state level organizations. How would somebody living in New Hampshire find allies in the state of New Hampshire to help them learn about and resist voucher movements that are happening in the state legislature there?
Yeah, I mean, Carol, you might know some of these more than me, but I used to lobby for the ACLU of Georgia, and the groups that I worked a lot with were like the local PTAs that oppose vouchers. The local, we worked with the NEA, we worked with the PTAs, we worked with the ACLU, we worked with parents organizations that are trying to stand up for their kids. And SOS in Arizona, as Carol was talking about, is a bunch, it's like teachers and parents who just got together, talk about grassroots. They really just created it from like the ground up. And so I think if you sort of connect in with PTAs and your ACLUs and your unions, even again, like getting on their lists, I think that can be really helpful. Great
suggestion. Carol, what would you add to that?
Yeah, the Network for Public Education, and you can find us at networkforpubliceducation.org. We have a grassroots network. And if you, the slider kind of goes around, wait for it, you'll see it, and you click on it. And what it will show is groups in pretty much every state, often many groups that are grassroots groups that are united in opposition to a lot of what we talked about today and are real pro-public education advocates. Some of them are tiny and small, and some of them are big and powerful. And what all of them share in common is that they are ordinary citizens, primarily composed of parents who deeply care about supporting public education. We have their contact information, so you can join.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm trying to think of what other issues come up for us as advocates. I was in a public conversation some time ago around these issues, and a report that was lifted up to me as coming out of Florida that said that it documented that the presence of charter schools in a school district improved the educational performance of everybody else around it. And that's the kind of argument when it's presented as being grounded in evidence and data, and I don't have the critique of that report, it silences me. So how, in that kind of public conversation that I'm having with somebody, what would you recommend? What are my response options to have a civil conversation about this topic?
Well, that particular study, it actually was based, they may have shown it to you in Florida, it was based in New York City. I did an analysis of it in the Washington Post. You could probably find it. It was, I thought, a very poor study. None of the results were statistically significant. The only result that was statistically significant was it showed that in those local public schools, the spending went up. Now, I'm not quite sure why, but the spending went up. So the real conclusion you come to is if you put more money into a public school, the kids do better. But for whatever reason, the person who wrote this study, unfortunately, what's happening now is that a lot of advocacy organizations and think tanks that are funded by some of the families that we've talked about previously and organizations put out their own research, and it's not particularly good. I don't think it was the case in that study, but a good place to go is the National Education Policy Center, NEPC. They are excellent at putting out all kinds of studies and research that debunk a lot of the false information that's out there, or that criticize some of the studies, and they are absolute objective brokers in all of this. It's hard because there's a lot out there. I mean, I'm lucky I have a doctorate in education. I did a lot of research work, so I can look at some of them and say, hey, wait a minute. But, I mean, I think the response to that is, well, that's very interesting. Can you have to get past the headline, though, sometimes and look at the details. And I would ask the person, well, what other studies do you have that show this example? And were the results statistically significant? Otherwise, even if there is an increase, it could be chance. I mean,
yeah. So we're having a little bit of technical difficulty on our call, and we don't have Mary Liz. She's trying to get back on again, but she's not here yet. So what I'd like to do for folks who are on the call, and it's nice to see, let's see, I'm just gonna share some of these comments from folks. From Becky Glover. She writes, one of the challenges we most often encounter in Mississippi is the lack of awareness or understanding about how underfunded our public schools are in the first place, which makes families eager to just try anything. I mean, we can understand parents get desperate. We've had a state funding law in the books since 1997. And the schools have actually been funded fully according to that formula only 2 times in the intervening 21 years. So these issues are big. And then what happens, of course, for these desperate parents, as Becky points out, the charter and the privatization, it feels like a solution to a problem over which these parents feel so helpless. So as people of faith, as people, and even if we aren't coming from a religious perspective, those of us who are invested in the common good, who believe in cultivating local communities where all children can thrive, what at the most local level, what are our options? What are the options for the parents like the folks that Becky describes? Maggie, do you want to start on that?
I mean, it is always a really difficult situation, right? Because if there is a kid in a school that is not performing well, you want to do anything to help your kid in that situation. The problem, of course, is that you're going to end up, if you give them a voucher, you are more likely to end up in a low quality school. One of the scenarios in Florida, for example, is that I think it's like 90% of their private schools are not accredited. And so a big problem that is happening in Florida is kids are going into the voucher program. They think, I have a problem with my public school. This is a great opportunity for me. I mean, the state is touting it's got to be a great program. It's a private school. And then they graduate and they can't go to college because they just graduated from an unaccredited school and they had no idea. And so I really do think that the advocacy, even on the local level of your local school boards and your local city councils of giving more money into the public school to improve the public school, because that is what makes a difference, right? Like vouchers are not education reform. If you say my public school isn't working in these 5 ways, if you give a kid a voucher, you didn't fix those 5 problems. In fact, you just drained more money away from fixing those 5 problems. And so that can't be the solution. And, the states can't afford to have multiple school systems, right? We are now setting ourselves up so that we have a public school system. We don't take a position on charter, so you can put that wherever you want. And then we would have a private school system. And now we are somehow funding the administration of 2 separate school systems. And then, again, you look at Arizona where they have, multiple different ESAs that are being administrated, and then a tuition tax credit. And then, what are we doing to ourselves, right? Like they all have different rules. Nobody understands the different rules and how they work and who's putting them together. And so, I do recognize that it can be hard if your student is in a spot where you're not happy with the public schools and you want to do everything you can for your kid. But I do think that it is advocating for improvements for the public school for all, because you just have no idea what you're getting with a voucher.
Mm. I think it's helpful for us to remember this distinction, Maggie, that you were making between private schools and accredited schools, right? So a school can be a private school without being accredited. An independent school is the technical terminology that usually refers to a private school that is accredited. The National Association of Independent Schools have very stringent accreditation requirements that their members have to meet. But a private school does not necessarily have to meet those criteria.
And even with accreditation, it depends on who the accrediting agency is, right? So like sometimes you might have someone who's very stringent, and then, you know, there are some religious accreditation organizations that will accredit a school that's teaching creationism or, you know, has anti-LGBT policies and teachings. And so all of those things play in there too. Who is accrediting the school, even if they are accredited?
Right, right. And I want to take a moment just to name the race issues implicit in a lot of these statewide movements. The history of public education, especially in the South, but not exclusively, because it played out differently in the North, was that after Brown v. Board of Education, there were lots and lots of white families who did not want their children to be educated in a school with Black children. And so a lot of the private academies, the Christian academies, the so-called Christian academies, were founded as an alternative. And I am not saying that that everybody who supports vouchers is in favor of race segregation, but we need to understand that that these movements have their roots in that pernicious commitment on the part of a lot of white people to maintaining separate. But as we've known for 60 years now, separate is never equal. And we, as a nation, I believe, will never grow into the fullness of all that we can be until our children are all being highly educated and being educated together, sitting next to each other in the classrooms. All our children is committed to doing this work through a race equity lens, and I didn't want to leave this conversation without putting that issue squarely on the table. We'll be moving to closure in a couple of minutes, but I do want to, Mary Liz, do we have any questions? Mary Liz is back to us, but she's had some technical difficulties. Mary Liz, do we have any questions from our participants?
You should check the chat because my technical difficulties has made it so that I lost my original chat.
Okay.
So
all right.
What's come in? I apologize to everyone.
All right. We're glad to have you back. I'm scrolling back up, looking at the chat and seeing lots of participation and wonderful suggestions and comments, which is wonderful. If anybody has a particular question for either of our panelists, please put them into the chat, and we will share them.
And I can see everything happening in the chat from here forward.
Okay. Okay. All right. That's great. But I wanted let's just stick with this race equity lens for a minute and invite Carol, you first, and then Maggie, just to share your. We didn't queue this question up, so I'm asking you to step right in, just speaking from your heart and your experience, but just reflect with us on the race equity implications of this privatization movement, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you talked about before was right on target. There was a name for them. They were called segregation academies. And they were the first forms of vouchers, or one of the first forms of vouchers, or desire for vouchers. And what we've seen, there have been many studies that have shown this, is that this idea of choice expands, that this is an unintended consequence. Places become more segregated. This has been especially true in the state of North Carolina with the proliferation of charter schools. What charter schools have become in North Carolina, and in the state of Delaware as well, is a place for white families to flee the integrated schools. So, and it's the truth of the matter is that whenever you set up all of these different silos, what tends to happen, and maybe it's part of our human condition, is that we want to go to places and spaces where there are people who are just like us, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost a human instinct, but it's not one of our better ones. Mm-hmm. And where there's been a lot of, one country that has really gone down the road of school privatization is Chile. Now in Chile, you don't have a lot of diversity in terms of race, but you do have SES diversity.
Social and economic status, so income.
Thank you, yeah.
And class, yeah.
Yeah. And what's happened, the kind of system that they have is they have their, what they call, they have their public schools, they have a name for them. I think they're called, oh gosh, I can't remember, municipal schools or something like that. Then they have, everybody's entitled to a voucher. Then they have private schools that will take only the voucher. And then they have other schools that take the voucher, plus the parents can add a little bit of money. And then they have private schools that say, no, we won't take the vouchers or the voucher kids. And you can see the stratification in the society along those four groups. And now they've created such a horror story. They're trying to unwind it, and you're finding parents who are saying, no, don't you dare take away my right to give extra money to get a more exclusive school for my child along with the voucher. You know, it's like Humpty Dumpty. Once you break the public education system, you can't easily put it back together again.
And that's what we observed in the story I told earlier in the call about this very local experience at the local elementary school, because by the time the governance came back under the governance of the Boston public school system, that team of teachers had been so exhausted by this transitions one after the other that anybody who had an option to go teach in a more stable environment had left, even though the previous principal had done a terrific job of team building. Maggie, do you have any comments that you'd like to add around the race equity lens on this question?
Sure. So racial segregation is higher at private schools than at public schools. And in addition, white students use vouchers more than students of color. And so, I think, again, it is often portrayed as something that's going to help African-American students in schools that are not serving them, and that isn't who it ends up helping. In addition, we sort of touched on this earlier, but if you go to a private school using a voucher, you lose a lot of your federal non-discrimination rights. And so most programs do say on the local level, you can't discriminate on the basis of race. But what they are missing is a lot of the actual protections that go with it, right? So if you're in a school that has federal protections, not only does the law just say you can't discriminate against a student on the basis of race, but there's actual mechanisms for enforcing that, right? Like there's people at the Department of Education, there's ways to complain, there's mechanisms to sue, there's a setup for complaints and fixing the complaints. The DC voucher program, for instance, you lose your federal rights that protect against discrimination for race, though the statute does say you can't discriminate on the basis of race. But what are you going to do? Who are you going to tell? How are they going to enforce it? How are they going to check it? And so there's no teeth there into that protection. And, girls who go to voucher schools lose their Title IX protections to make sure that they're not discriminated against. In North Carolina, they can discriminate against you based on, they can say, you're Episcopalian, I'm not taking your kids. Your kids aren't Lutheran. You lose your IDEA rights, you lose your due process rights. And, a lot of these protections are there to help kids in minority situations. So who's most likely to be kicked out of these schools, right, and not have their due process rights respected is African-American kids. And then they're going to private schools that don't even have these basic due process rights for them. And so, I think the civil rights protections are really, really important. And I know a lot of people will say to me, well, parents chose these schools, and so they're okay with losing their rights. I just don't think that parents understand the implications of losing those rights. And there have been federal studies that show that, kids with disabilities going to private schools, and they asked, what do you tell parents? How do you tell them? What do parents understand? And the report showed that most parents have no idea what it means to lose those rights because the programs don't effectively explain it.
So we've had a question from one of our participants that I think is exactly on this topic that you've just been talking about, and I wonder, as we begin to wind up, if we can pull out some sort of headlines. So the question is that more school choice is dangled in front of parents, and he uses this great phrase as a shiny object that lures them into a quagmire that they are not equipped to navigate because they're not equipped to navigate it. So then the question is, what do parents need to know in order to be more informed, and in order, when they see that shiny object, in order to not fall for the bait, so to speak. So one of them is this question of protecting rights, that children in public schools have guaranteed rights, and there is an enforcement mechanism, and there is a complaint office, so to speak, right? So, and that has to do with discrimination, either around IDEA, which is the individual with disabilities. So that has to do with learning disabilities, but also physical disabilities. It has to do with LGBTQ issues. It has to do with race, and it has to do with gender. So, so one of the questions that parents should be equipped to ask before they fall for the bait is what protections does this school provide, not only my child, but the other children who are there with my child, to guarantee the child's rights. So what other sort of headline issues? So learning outcomes is another one that we've talked about on this call. What's the evidence that this alternative to my local public school is going to provide a higher quality educational experience for my child? Right? And then it's tough for parents who don't have PhDs in education policy, the way Carol does, to be able to analyze that answer. But that's a second. So there are two. So the one is the legal protections, and the other is the learning outcomes. The third argument I think we've heard on this call has to do with the social fabric of your community, making sure that the children in the story that Carol told from Chile is really chilling, right? I mean, what happens to a culture when children only know people from their own social class? So would either of you, Carol or Maggie, would you add any others to those three?
Yeah, I would. If I were a parent, I think it's important to ask, let me see your balance sheet.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many horrible players in this field. I mean, if you think about it, if you think about the voucher schools and even some of the charter schools, what other places there in America where you can get taxpayer money to go off and kind of do your own thing and run a business with very, very little transparency? So
that gets to how much money are you taking in? Where is it going? How much of it is being spent on the children's education, and what's happening to that surplus?
And a lot of these places get shut down. I mean, that is a huge problem. Parents, there are stories in the news all the time. We follow them. Part of our website, we list them, where kids will show up to school one day and the school's closed. Where teachers aren't being paid, and then suddenly it comes out that they haven't been paid and the school is shut down. So, and then everybody is scrambling, trying to get their child into a public school, which is now overwhelmed because suddenly 1,000 kids show up. I mean, if it's an exaggeration, but several hundred kids show up on their doorstep.
Yeah.
So, where is the transparency? Because I will tell you, it's not there. Is there an audit? Can I see the audit? Right? What are the salaries of the people that are running the school? There are no policies, for example, with conflict of interest, the way they are in public schools, so that you have people who are selling items to the school, also serving on the board of the school. That can't happen in a public school. So digging into all of that's important because it talks about the viability of the school you're sending your child to.
Right, right.
I think
we need to wrap up, I'm afraid.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, and we want to actually, I'm going to invite Mary Liz in, because we value our participants' feedback. So we want to invite the folks who've been listening in on this conversation to give us some feedback. And Mary Liz has posted in the Mary Liz, are you there? Do you want to do this part?
So I just posted a link in the chat box to a very quick 2-minute evaluation form. We want to hear your feedback, all of it, what worked for you, what didn't work for you, what you would like to see done differently next time. We take these in and we learn from them each time, and we hope that it helps shape the next one so that it's better for more people. And you can also leave us your thoughts right in the chat box, what worked well, what didn't work well, what you'd like to see us do differently next time. But there's a link to this quick form, and we would love for you to fill that out.
And while you're filling that out, I want to invite you to join us in addition to these panel discussions that we have on the 4th Tuesday of every month. On the 1st Tuesday of every month, we have a direct presentation from a practitioner on a topic of interest. So next week, on Tuesday, June 5th, Aaron Jenkins, who is the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the Expectations Project, is going to be offering a free online training course pertaining to Education Advocacy 101. And it's going to cover topics such as what is advocacy, how can we faithfully do it within the church without stepping over, into any the swamp of conflict between church and state. And we'll cover some models and some strategies that people can use to help students in your own communities. So we hope that you'll join us. Thank you all for being with us today, and thank you, Carol and Maggie. This has been lively and really, really informative, and we're so grateful to have had your expertise with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Allie, can you just check to see that you stop broadcasting live on Facebook if it didn't do that when I disconnected?
The options seem to be view stream on Facebook, copy streaming link. I bet I can.
It doesn't say stop streaming. I think it's probably stopped itself.
The recording light is still blinking, however.
Yeah, that's separate. You can stop recording now too.
I still have something that says live on Facebook.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, me too.
It does give a stop live stream.
Where do you see that?
Mine says, do you want me to just click on stop live stream and see if it works?
Yes, please. Oh.
Did it work?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, apparently someone gave me that ability. I don't know.
We're still recording, but I think that's just within Zoom.